great band, and why the music was so well structured. And so I just became very fascinated with this crossover idea, and also in large part because I never understood why, as a classical musician, I was going to have to choose. Why would I just be interested in classical music? That just seemed like nonsensical to me. I'd always loved rock and roll, and there just seemed to be like this artificial barrier, you know, like a bundling board, right, in everyone's official. You know what bundling boards are? Well, in the 17th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, you could have your girlfriend or boyfriend come over and spend the night because they may have had to walk 6 miles to get to see you, right? And you would spend the night in the same bed. There'd be a board down the middle of the bed so that nothing naughty would happen. It was called a bundling board, right? Well, in classical music, there's this extreme prejudice about the Beatles and rock and roll, and it's not really good music, and it's not substantial, and it doesn't deserve scholarly treatment, and blah, blah, blah. This just never made any sense to me. So I taught this exco course on the music of the Beatles as I went to these conservatories, and it became very apparent to me that there was a book there. So I wrote my first book as I was getting my master's degree. I had a book contract, and once I had the book contract, I realized, oh, this is exactly what I want to do. I want to write this book and then go write more books. So that's kind of how it happened. But it wasn't at the time in 1985 when I got this first book contract on the Beatles. There was no such thing as a Beatles scholar, right? And so it was, you know, it was just something that just like, you know, I'm just too passionate about it not to do it. That's kind of how it happened.
Well, it's obviously not the first book about the Beatles. It probably won't be the last. And one of the things that's so interesting to me is that the musical sensibility that you have as a critic, as a musician, really informs the narrative of this book. Talk a little bit about how you take the music and kind of go into the narrative from that perspective, and how maybe that sets it apart from, you know, I'm not going to ask you why another book about the Beatles, I promise. I think that we know that that's not an important question, but what it is that makes this one sing the way that it does.
Oh, well, that's very nice of you to say. I was very inspired by Peter Guralnick's book on Elvis Presley from, I forget, 10, 15 years ago. It's a big 2-volume thing. If you haven't read it, it's one of the great biographies ever written. And he's very sensitive, got a great ear, and very sensitive to the music history that informed Elvis Presley's understanding of rock and roll. So what you get is you get Elvis Presley's life, but you also get this fabulous detail of the music history of how Elvis experienced music growing up and what he valued in music and how the music made sense to him. And the more research that I did on Liverpool and where John grew up, the more I realized that the British have a very different experience of rock and roll history than we do here in America. And until the Beatles came along, we really took it for granted. We really just kind of thought, well, this is our music, it's our style, and it makes sense to American ears, but we really didn't think, how does this sound to other people in the world? And remember, when the Beatles first appeared on Ed Sullivan in February 1964, I mean, the idea that a British band was going to play American music, this was radical in the extreme. I mean, this was just unthinkable. The analogy I like to make is that it's kind of like, you know, you're a baseball fan, and all of a sudden at the World Series, all these Norwegians start showing up and being great baseball players or something. It would just be just bizarre like that. Like, what do they possibly see in this game? Because we're Americans, we take it for granted, right? So the 4 major themes of rock and roll that I talk about when I teach a history of rock is race, class, demography, which is just a fancy word for generation gap, right? The kids protesting against the parents, and gender, all kinds of new ideas about gender in rock and roll. Well, the more I got to learn about the British experience of rock and roll, the more fascinated I became with the idea of, I really wanted to tell the story of what was John Lennon's version of rock and roll. So why is he attracted to certain rock and rollers, and why are the British attracted to certain rock and rollers that aren't as, I don't want to say as important or as, you know, there's a great crop of rock and rollers that come out between 1955 and 1960. The British gravitate towards different ones than we do, all right? So Buddy Holly is a key piece of that. Now, Buddy Holly is so big in Britain, it's very hard to describe to Americans how big he is over there. They have Buddy Holly conventions in England, okay? They have, Eddie Cochran is another one. Eddie Cochran, they swear, so when Andrew Loog Oldham talks about Eddie Cochran's death in Britain, it happens on his only tour of Britain. Britons they're mortified that Eddie Cochran goes all the way over there and dies in a car crash. They say he spilled blood on English soil. They worship the ground this guy walks on. Well, Eddie Cochran he's not in the American top tier of rock and rollers, but all the British bands cover Eddie Cochran songs. The Rolling Stones are big Eddie Cochran fans. Led Zeppelin covered Eddie Cochran. The Who do Summertime Blues by Eddie Cochran, okay? So it occurred to me that there's this kind of alternate history of rock and roll that as Americans, we have not appreciated as much. And I really wanted to write the story of what it felt like to be John Lennon growing up in Liverpool, and what were the sounds that he heard, and what attracted him to rock and roll, and what version of rock and roll history did he then reflect back to us. That became really, really interesting to me.
But you can't do that without interweaving the importance of John's early life in Liverpool. And one of the things that's so interesting about your book is that you spend such a big part of it debunking John mythology. I think that the common story is that John, abandoned by his father, and mother takes him in and then sort of leaves him off with an aunt. But you have this very poignant moment where he actually is asked to choose between the two, which I had never heard before. Could you just tell us about that?
Yeah, and it's a key moment in young John Lennon's life. You think he's about 5 years old in the summer of 1946, and his father, who was a sea merchant who has not been around and participating very much in his life, comes home and takes him off for a holiday in Blackpool. And he's actually staying with his aunt at this point, and the aunt kind of reluctantly lets him go off with his father, Alf. Now, Alf actually has other motives. Alf is actually thinking of kidnapping him and taking him to New Zealand. So we might have had a Beatles from New Zealand. I mean, it's very weird how this works out. But so Alf is there in Blackpool with him, and John is 5 years old, doesn't really know his dad, is thrilled to be off at a holiday camp with his dad. And the mother, Julia, shows up because she figures out that Alf might actually be kidnapping, and she's going to make sure that doesn't happen. She doesn't know what to think, but it's very strange that Alf has taken the boy off to Blackpool. Well, she shows up, and she and Alf have a conversation in the front room at Blackpool. Alf begs her to come back to him, even though she's had another child by another man, and her current boyfriend is waiting outside. Alf says, in his memoirs, he says, "I could tell she still loved me." He begs her to come back. She refuses. She will not get back together with Alf. And they said, well, we're at a stalemate. We don't know what to do. They call John in from the kitchen, 5-year-old John Lennon, and they say, what do you want to do? You have to choose. Do you want to go back to Liverpool with your mother, or do you want to go off to New Zealand with your father? Well, so it's just this horrifying psychological quandary to give a 5-year-old kid, right? And you realize this scarred him for life, probably, because he chose his father, who he didn't know very well, and he watched his mother leave the room and start walking down the street. And then he has a fit of insecurity, and he races after his mother and goes home with his mother, never sees his father again for 20 years. So in most Lennon biographies, this scene is given about 2 or 3 sentences. And every time I would read a Lennon biography and read that scene, I would think, oh my God, how can you just deal with that in a paragraph as though, yes, this must have been very hard. To me, that's like a core psychological issue. And that's a germ of so many different ways in which he handled intimate relationships for the rest of his life, right? I mean, that would screw up a fairly normal person. But, you know, a wildly creative, aggressive, talented comic genius like John Lennon, I mean, he grappled with that on the inside forever and ever. So I felt like that had not been properly framed. I kept having conversations with people who were very familiar with the Beatles story and with Lennon's own biography, and who really had to say, is that what happened, really? They had not really fully absorbed that story, and I thought we need a narrative that's going to frame that properly and give the proper weight to that story that can help us better understand Lennon.
Well, it's interesting because it does frame the way that you talk about putting his other very difficult relationships with people in context. In the book you call Yoko Ono a decoy, a clever, cynical one to foster his breakup with the Beatles. And we talked a little bit about how really he was incapable of ending things, and so he just mishandled things. The scene that you just described with his mother and her boyfriend standing outside really does parallel really the way he sort of went to deliver the news to Cynthia that their marriage was over. Just paint that picture. That was, again, a story I had never really heard about.
Right, so So Cynthia Lennon, the first wife, she has 2 books, and she describes this episode in her second book about Lennon walks out on her. Well, it's much messier than that. I mean, it's very involved how that happens. But she tries to contact him for several weeks after this marriage ends, and he's living with Yoko Ono at Paul McCartney's house in London. And he finally agrees to a meeting, and he shows up at his old house where his wife and son are, and he shows up with Yoko Ono and sits down and accuses Cynthia of cheating on him in the marriage, which is just bizarre. I mean, he's run off with another woman, but he comes back and accuses his wife of being unfaithful to him. I mean, it's just bizarre. But what that gets at, it's very, very reminiscent of that early scene of him, because his son Julian is there, and he's very, very hostile to his kid Julian, who's in the middle of this breakup. I mean, it's just awful how many echoes of the childhood revisit him in his adult life and revisit his kids in his adult life, right? Because, of course, his second son, Sean, is robbed of a father when he's 5 years old. Mm-hmm. So the cyclical nature of this family dysfunction is really quite fascinating. It's fascinating when it happens to other people. When it's happening to you, it's overwhelming, right? And you spend your life dealing with that, with those psychological issues. So one of the main mission of the book was to separate these myths that exist from the reality of what really happened. Yoko is one of the key myths of the Beatles. Is Yoko comes along and breaks up the band, which is very simplistic, and it has really disturbing undertones of racism. And I would go see Let It Be in the early '70s, and she would come on screen, and you would hear hissing, and sometimes you still hear that, and I just think that's so unfortunate. Because Lennon really was in love with this woman, and it's very clear to me she was in love with him too. And it's very clear to me that he had wanted out of the band for at least a couple of years by the time that he runs off with Yoko. What happens with Yoko is that he figures out if he imposes Yoko on the band, that will be a good way for him to extricate himself.
That story also really devalues something that you also talk about, which is that she gave up a career to be with him. And this is sort of our impression of Yoko as an interloper. Really, Yoko was a celebrity in her world, in some ways in a more avant-garde way than John was. And now she is Mrs. John Lennon.
Yeah, she's a very difficult character to come to terms with. And the main thing about her is that she's not simple. She's very complicated. John always spoke about how much he admired her creativity and her humor. Now, people don't think of Yoko Ono as a humorous dame. But one of the ironies of the whole story is that once John Lennon is killed, she kind of steps into the role of rock widow a little bit too well. In other words, she has managed his legacy almost as if she was born to do it. And there's something a little bit disconcerting about that. But then there's another layer of irony that comes along after Paul McCartney marries Heather Mills, and that is that Heather Mills winds up making Yoko look good. Which is just a sublime piece of... So as a writer, you just said, this material is just fabulous material. You just can't resist it,
You can't make it up.
No, you can't make it up, yeah.
One of the things that's very interesting, we'll talk a little bit about a couple of the songs and what was happening, but we were talking backstage a little bit. I've always been very interested in the major transition of John Lennon's voice. Early John Lennon, you hear this growly pop. It almost sounds like an imitation of an American rock star, and twist and shout. And then I think the John Lennon that we think of now when we think of John Lennon music is the Strawberry Fields Forever voice, that sort of mask-infused, more in the head, more fluid, dynamic voice. What's the story there with that change? How did he feel about his voice?
Yeah, so he's famous for, he said this to many, many people, both publicly and privately to several engineers. He never liked the sound of his own voice, which is a key irony to the whole story, because I always think of John Lennon as just my favorite rock and roll singer of all time. I'd rather hear John Lennon sing a Chuck Berry song than Chuck Berry, and I love Chuck Berry. But I just think Lennon has the most direct, the access to the emotional colors that he channels through his singing is always so pure and direct. You can tell exactly what he's feeling as he's singing, and it's invisible. There is no distance between the singer and the listener. When he's singing, you know exactly what he's feeling and the emotions that he's conveying. It's extremely clear, direct singing. And I think that the journey of him as a singer is something on the order of, he's not very self-conscious as a young singer. He's simply so passionate about the music that he barrels through. It's like he's a race car driver. He just gets in those cars and just drives them for all they're worth, you know. As he gets more self-conscious, and as his writing gets more and more sophisticated and involved and intricate, the melodic lines that he writes for himself actually turn out to be really tough later on. And his singing has to accommodate some of the more difficult writing that he's doing for himself. Plus he becomes more, he adopts more psychological perspectives in the songs, the influence of Dylan there, and he just becomes more self-conscious of how he sounds and the technology that has grown up around him as a singer. So he's more, the vocals have more layers, they're more nuanced, you can hear him listening to himself a lot more than you did early on. Of course, the other thing you have to talk about, when you talk about John Lennon's singing and the early, you call it an imitation of an American pop. So one irony people talk about is that they don't use British accents in their singing so much. So we talk about the Sex Pistols as the first British rock and roll singing because they sing with their thick accents, right? The Beatles are doing something very interesting. It's not so much that they're trying to sound American, to my ear anyway, is that they're not as extremely self-conscious about trying to sound black. And the key comparison there would be Mick Jagger, who is very clearly dying to adopt all these black mannerisms that he loves in the vocal styles of the R&B singers he adores. And Lennon and McCartney have for them, it's almost not about race in this very interesting way. And it'd be very curious to see, to hear Lennon try and imitate black styling because he so successfully navigates right around that and makes you forget, oh yeah, Twist and Shout is sung by black people. It's an Isley Brothers song, right? It's actually written by a white guy. And the original record is by a white band. It's very interesting. That's new scholarship in the book, too. But he does not imitate his black exemplars in the idea that he needs to sound black in order to pull it off. And you get the idea that he would kind of sound faintly ridiculous the way Mick Jagger often does, because he's so preoccupied with trying to sound black. But they steer just right around the whole race issue. So for them, it's much more a class issue. The class politics of rock and roll much more important to them than the racial politics. And the singing, I think, starts from just that deep gut-level passion. One of my favorite quotes is Lennon says, rock and roll goes straight to the gut. It doesn't have to pass through the mind. You know? Our most intellectual rock and roller, right, says goes straight for the gut. I love that.
So myths and music. We've talked a little bit about myths. We talked a little bit about music. I have a couple of questions for you, things I just kind of want to know. And you're here, you're a Beatles scholar, so maybe you can clear them up for me. I've always heard that John wrote Norwegian Wood to be able to write about his affair with Yoko without his wife finding out. I mean, to me, it wasn't as subtle as all of that. What is the real context of that song?
So it can't be about Yoko because it's too early. Because he meets Yoko in November 1966. But he was rather free. His zipper was open pretty much the whole career. He was having lots of affairs. So Philip Norman, the British biographer, has some research in his book that indicates that he thinks it's actually Robert Freeman's wife who he has an affair with, and that's who that song is about. And that's pretty persuasive in his book. Of course, I'm not as interested in who he slept with and why. It's that my book is different. I'm concerned with a lot of different things than that. But it's pretty clear that that song is about having an extramarital affair and, in a funny kind of way, the way only Lennon could do this, but putting it into a song as a way of covering it up. So it's going to be a big hit song. Millions of people are going to hear this, but that's how he's going to keep it from his wife.
Well, I wouldn't have written a song about it if it were true, right? What about Help being about the noise of the fans drowning out the Beatles' ability to make real music? That's another...
Yeah, well, I think Help... he talked about Help later on as having a fairly autobiographical cast, as though he was feeling rather lost in the midst of Beatlemania and feeling as though he didn't have much of an identity, and this Beatle identity never really did suit him very well. He was always very uncomfortable with the mop-top identity. One of my favorite stories that I tell in the book, which Andrew Loog Oldham writes about in his memoirs of the 60s. For my money, Andrew Loog Oldham's memoirs of the 60s, he's the manager of the Rolling Stones. And he writes a 2-volume memoir, Stoned and Too Stoned. And he tells the story of taking John Lennon to hear the Rolling Stones at a Richmond club in 1963. And John Lennon comes out of the club ecstatic. They're just what we were like before Brian put us in suits, he said. I'm in the wrong band. And that quote is just, for me, that's the $1 million quote. And that tells you a lot about how uncomfortable he was in the Beatle band and how uncomfortable he was cleaning up that act, because when they were at the Cavern, they were in leather and they smoked cigarettes and they cursed on stage. I mean, they were defiant rebels. All right? And Brian Epstein's idea was, the way we'll get these guys on television is we'll put them in suits and we'll make them bow at the same time. We'll make them presentable. And the genius behind what Brian Epstein did was he cleaned up their visual appearance, but he did not touch the music. So the music was still raucous and had great jauntiness and rakishness, you know, and liveliness. And so there was a kind of irony between what you heard and what you saw with early Beatles. Because yes, they were presentable, but you know, Lennon goes to that, the famous early story about him in the Royal Command performance and saying, those of you in the cheaper seats, clap your hands. Those of you in the more expensive seats, just rattle your jewelry. Right? He had threatened backstage, he had threatened Brian Epstein that he was going to say, just rattle your fucking jewelry. Which would have been the Scouser way of really saying, I don't care that royalty is in the audience. I'm a working class guy and we have already won this cultural war. Right? That's what he's saying to them. And to me, that is just so much a piece of who Lennon is that it makes a lot of sense that you can look at Help as, yes, he's not comfortable in those Beatle outfits and he's looking for a way out as early as 1965.
He's looking for a way out as early as 1965, and yet you sort of flash forward to the Let It Be sessions and the tapes. Obviously, there's a huge amount of tapes there for you to listen to, for anybody to listen to. Talk a little bit about what your perception was about John and Let It Be before you started researching this book and now. What did you discover there?
So, Let It Be is this very famous Beatles session in January of 1969. It basically lasts for all of January. It's only 2 months after the White Album is released. They are back in the studio trying to produce a documentary film that will build up to some kind of live concert event at the end to be the climax for the film. They are, the White Album sessions have been described as poisonous by an engineer who worked on those records. They were really fraying. The band was falling apart by this point. They really didn't want to be there, and yet what's curious is how some part of them, each of them, really did want to still be there because they still did have this amazing ensemble. So when they really did hit their grooves in those sessions, they still played dynamite. And the rooftop session is a testament to that. They play as well as they ever play on that rooftop, and it's in gigantic contrast to the rest of the sessions that build up to that. But Lennon is curiously, so we have this great irony, you know, we have more tapes from the Let It Be sessions than any other Beatles session, but they're the worst Beatles sessions. I mean, if we had had the same amount of tapes for the Revolver sessions or the Pepper sessions, we would be in Nirvana because those were extremely, they were working so well together, they were humming together as a band. And Let It Be, they're really not humming together. There's a lot of dissent, there's a lot of conflict, and that shows up on the screen much more than it does in the music. But my theory about why Lennon is so curiously reticent in the Let It Be sessions, it's very curious. The more you get to know the Beatles, the weirder it is how quiet Lennon is during the whole Let It Be movie, because it doesn't make any sense. Because he's clearly the loudmouth, the character, the big personality, the guy who would be talking a blue streak. But he's curiously quiet. So I said to Barry Miles, who I interviewed, who is you know, famously co-wrote the Paul McCartney autobiography, and he was an Apple staffer, was close to the band, and he gave me this amazing response to this question. I said, well, you know, the White Album had come out, and then Yoko had a miscarriage in November of '68, so are they grieving that miscarriage? Is that why Lennon is so quiet in Let It Be? he just waved me off and said, oh, you're just so wrong about that. He said, we knew that he was on heroin all through 1968, and we were glad about it because it got him off acid. And I said, my jaw hit the floor, and he saw my response, and he said, well, you have to remember, we didn't have Hendrix and Joplin and Jim Morris. We didn't have these casualties. Heroin was regarded as rather an elitist drug, and the problem with heroin was it was so expensive. So if you were having to rob people to pay for your habit, that was bad. But if you were rich and could afford it, it was an elitist drug, and there were not all these cautionary tales out there yet. It was seen as a lifestyle choice. So apparently, and we have more evidence to support this, that he is getting sort of more strung out on heroin that month. And that's why he's not, but it is also of a piece of him trying to extricate himself from the band. We have quotes from those tapes where the Beatles are saying, we don't know what to do with this guy. He'll come to band meetings and he will not speak. He insists Yoko speak for him. And we don't know how to deal with this. And McCartney says, yeah, I know, it's crazy. We're not writing songs together anymore. But I can't confront him with this because he'll just leave. And McCartney is very protective and very interested in keeping that band together. So it was a very delicate political dance that was going on there. And it forced me to re-examine how strung out on substances he was from 1966 through 1969. To hear that quote, to hear that insider speak, I mean, it's totally on the record too. And he's still friendly with McCartney. It's funny. Some people will not talk. Some people will talk and tell you stories. This guy sat down. The first thing he said was, "Everything I say is on the record." You don't get that. You just don't get that. And he knew. And so, you know, I consider it a very good source, and it's plausible. It makes a lot of sense.
But it's very poignant because that same dynamic leads to "Don't Let Me Down," which is a song that you sort of describe as a real farewell. And you have the timeline of how that song was written, like very precisely mapped out now.
Yeah. Well, we didn't, you know, because we have so much of Let It Be on tape, we are able to do a lot better scholarship on how the songs took shape and when they were written. He didn't bring it in until very late in those sessions. They worked it out several days before the rooftop. It comes together incredibly quickly. And it's just, in my mind, it's a prime Beatle masterpiece. It's a major late Lennon statement about running off with Yoko, but also, subtextually, he's saying goodbye to this band. And what's wonderful about it is that the band is holding him and saying goodbye to him, too, as he sings this new love song to Yoko. He's singing about the risk he takes in a love affair, and there's these wonderful harmonies that Paul McCartney chimes in on in some of the later parts of that song where it's so clear what they're doing is saying goodbye to each other. And some of these late duets I just am fascinated by because they have this real twilight tone to them, and it's very clear they're at the end of their road together. They know it. Two of Us is another example of a song like that. I've Got a Feeling. So we have 3 songs on the rooftop that really are, you know, this is it. We know we're close. We're saying goodbye.
And I think that the relationship afterwards, there's the very public perception of the relationship between John and Paul after the Beatles. I think there's a lot of public sniping, the sort of sense that everything was about, are you going to reconcile? But you also describe sort of, I think, an unknown personal relationship that continued between the two of them, despite the fact that they didn't want to reconcile. Right.
We didn't really know this until much later, so the early biographies don't deal with this, and we have a lot of scholarship now that helps us understand. It seems like Lennon and McCartney are in much closer touch in the early 70s than we had previously thought. I talked to members of the Elephant's Memory Band who recorded with Lennon in the summer of 1972, and they said to me it was absolutely normal for the phone to ring, and Lennon would take the call from Paul McCartney, and they would take an hour break or a 90-minute break, and Lennon would sit down and just chat with his good friend Paul McCartney there in the middle of the session. They said this happened all the time. This was very normal for it to happen this way. And they chatted about family. They chatted about what they were doing, where they were in their lives. They did not chat about business. So my interpretation of that is they were busy, their lawyers were busy carving each other up. And there's a very nasty business fight going on in the early 70s as they're trying to sort out their Apple interests, because they had all gone into business together. And they said, we're going to pool all our money. And almost as soon as they got that set up, they broke up. So they decided, oh, so now we all want a piece of that, and they did not get access to that money until they solved that business deal in 1975. So they're kind of hamstrung. I mean, they're busy making solo records and they can't access their money. And it's just a terrible, terrible business setup. So you know they're at war with each other business-wise, but they apparently kept their friendship going even as that was going on, because we have all these incredible stories about discussions that they had, the most dramatic of which is McCartney visiting John Lennon in Malibu, and he's just had a visit in London from Yoko Ono.
This is when they're broken up. This is when Lennon has left.
Lennon has, there's an 18-month period where the marriage is broken up, and he's in LA with a bunch of different projects. But he gets a visit from Paul McCartney. What does Paul McCartney say to him? I just had a visit from Yoko, and she says she wants you back. Now, what's curious about this story is not just that it's McCartney, it is not in McCartney's interest to get Lennon back with Yoko. So it tells you a great deal about their friendship, that that is a message that McCartney's willing to deliver to John Lennon.
Because his girlfriend that he was spending time with in California was actually encouraging him to collaborate with McCartney.
Right.
So the songwriting could have happened again had he not reconciled with Yoko, right?
If you believe May Pang, yes. Now there's problems with May Pang's testimony. There's problems with her motivation. So we don't know how much to believe that there is this giant desire on the part of Beatle fans that this songwriting partnership get back together. It's not clear to me how close they ever came to getting back together. What is clear to me is that there was a lot of discussion, a lot of personal contact that we didn't know about before, and that they kept it separate from their business interests. And that one of the reasons they did this was they were so sick and tired of reunion questions. Every single interview they did in the 70s after they broke up, almost immediately after they break up, they have to start dealing with reunion questions. So in order to avoid these reunion questions, they simply just kept their friendship off the radar. So it was very smart. They learned how to deal with the press, at least to that extent.
You also talk about Lennon's time in LA. One of the other reasons he came back was because he thought he was going to die out there.
Yeah. Well, he watched Phil Spector go off the rails in LA. You know, and early off the rails. You know, there's been so much. But Spector is easily out crazying Lennon in the studio, bringing shotguns into the studio. I mean, just wild, drunken behavior. And Lennon participates in a lot of this drunken behavior, but you also get the sense that he sees Spector as a little further out, and Spector has a terrible car crash in this period, and you get the sense that Lennon kind of sees Spector as, that's where I would be headed if I keep this up. And that he kind of says, you know, that's not what I want. And he kind of gets this idea, how can I steer myself out of this? Because in LA, he is pretty much a parody of a drunken, washed-up celebrity. And he sees that Rolling Stone magazine is reporting on him this way. And you really can get the sense that that's not how he wants to end up. So he makes a conscious decision to move back to New York after this visit from Paul McCartney, and he actually puts his marriage back together. And yes, I think that LA was, you know, it was a dangerous place for him. I think if he had stayed there, I don't think, I shudder to think what might have happened to him, yeah.
I want to leave some time for anybody who's here who has questions, but one of the choices you make in the book is not to mention Mark David Chapman by name. Was that an artistic choice or a moral choice?
Both. I felt as though, you know, history was going to record who this guy was. And, you know, John Lennon had no idea who he was. And he'd already gotten his due. I really felt like I did not want this guy's name in my book. I just felt very strongly about that. What was curious to me is that none of my editors noticed. And we didn't get, until the New York Times made a note of it, I haven't gotten questions about it. So it's very interesting to me. And so on one level, I'm very happy about that, because I pulled off the narrative without mentioning his name, and people didn't even notice. So the story makes sense. You don't have to mention this guy's name. And I just didn't want to feed that whole psychopathology of killing a celebrity and getting your name in a book. I just wanted nothing to do with that.
Yes. So one more question before the audience gets a turn. Your favorite Beatles song?
Oh. So
I'll give you 3.
Yeah, okay. I do early, middle, and late.
Okay.
Because that's how I divide them up. And since we're on Lennon tonight, I'll try and choose one McCartney in there, just because I'm not
I appreciate that.
I'm not pissy about McCartney.
We did have a conversation backstage. I asked him, what do you say to people for whom John Lennon is not their favorite Beatle? And I confessed that I usually lie and say George Harrison's my favorite because it's actually Paul McCartney, and that's kind of embarrassing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So go ahead now that you've had time to think about it.
So my favorite early Lennon song is "If I Fell" off of "Hard Day's Night," which is a beautiful duet. It's kind of an early. It's the same thematic material as "Don't Let Me Down." So you can look at those two songs as kind of bookends. It's an early version of the same thing, how scary it is to fall in love, and "Don't Let Me Down" is a bookend, a late career song on the same thing. It's also a beautiful duet with Paul McCartney. I mean, the beauty of those two voices blending, I've always prized in that song in particular. A middle period song, I would go with, let me go with Norwegian Wood. I know we've already talked about it. That has always been an intriguing song to me. So simple and yet so poetic. So many different layers of meaning going on in the song. And it's very artfully wrought. It's not a sentimental song by any means, and yet you get a great picture of how hurt this guy was by this affair that he has. And whether it's a real affair, whether it's just an emotional affair, you get a real idea of the depth of pain that the singer is in just through these very simple gestures in the song. And for a late period song, so here's where I'll go with McCartney is, there's one of my favorite records as a kid was "You Know My Name, Look Up the Number." People know this song. If you don't know it, go get Past Masters. It's on the singles collection. It was the B-side of Let It Be. And so it was one of my first records that I ever had. And it was like, this is the biggest band in the history of rock and roll. And the B-side was a complete novelty number where they did fake voices and they went from lounge singer to old granny singing gibberish, and just this weird setup of a song. It's a non-song. It's a piece of weird absurdity. It's just comic. It's like the Marx Brothers on hashish, is what it is. And it's just Paul and John alone in the studio just having a laugh. But it's the strangest, funniest record, and I still love that record. I still think, and it shows you their commitment to goofiness and silliness and absurdity and novelty records. They adored novelty records, and this is their version of a great novelty record.
They're very interesting choices. Does anybody in the audience have any questions for our Beatles scholar? I'll go to you first. You look familiar.
Could you give your opinion on why John's solo career was not as successful as Paul's, and why his solo music doesn't seem to have the same timelessness that Paul's solo music has?
The question, if anyone didn't hear, is why has John's solo career not been as timeless as Paul's?
Okay, so I disagree with the question. So let me just explain how I look at Lennon's career. So I think Lennon's career is a solo career. So post-Beatle career, I see as extremely uneven. But I see the highs as Plastic Ono Band, almost all of the singles, right? And I think half of Mind Games is good. I think Imagine is near great. I think Sometime in New York City is kind of underrated. I went back and listened to that record and studied that record and wrote about it again. I think there's some great songs on it. I think there's some weak moments, but I think it's an unduly, people's attitude about that record is very harsh. And then Double Fantasy is kind of a quandary. It's kind of a, what are we to make of this? It's very slick. I think it's a very respectable comeback, and I know he had more great stuff in it. I know, and I like the demos of Double Fantasy better than the finished version. Now, Paul McCartney, my opinion of the solo career, the solo stuff of Paul McCartney, I am obsessed with the first McCartney solo album. For me, that's the key McCartney record. It's just called McCartney. It's got Maybe I'm Amazed on it. And a lot of that is kind of insubstantial.